Good morning and welcome to Grand Rounds in the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and New York State Psychiatric Institute. I realize people will continue to filter in, but I wanted to make sure that we gave our distinguished speaker adequate time. I'm Jeremy Veenstra Vanderwill. For folks who don't know me, I'm the director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And this Grand Rounds is really a treat. It's an opportunity to highlight something that is a major issue for many of the children, adolescents, and families that we see. But something that oftentimes goes neglected within medical centers, the topic of learning disabilities. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to note next week Grand Rounds presentation is on recovery after a diagnosis of schizophrenia from Patricia. So look forward to that next week. And then wanted to make a couple of comments about this special Grand Rounds. This is the DeHirsch Grand Rounds. It honors Katrina DeHirsch, who is a speech therapist and real pioneer in learning disabilities. She was within the Children's Hospital of New York here, had a learning disabilities clinic prior to when learning disabilities were really broadly noted. Was somebody who provided clinical service over years and years and years and passed away at the age of 97 in 1996. And we've had the privilege of having this Grand Rounds as well as support in her honor for a fellowship program within the New York Presbyterian system over the succeeding years. I also wanted to note that this is an opportunity for us to highlight the PROMISE program. So the PROMISE program here at Columbia is a partnership with the PROMISE Project, a remarkable philanthropic endeavor that allows us here in the PROMISE Clinic to see children with learning disabilities, or initially they come in with concern about learning disabilities, who would otherwise never be able to access neuropsychological assessments. So having been at other institutions that will go nameless, I know that this is the thing that is the hardest to access for children who oftentimes present with mental health complications related to their learning disabilities. And frequently we're unable to do the assessment to provide a diagnosis that will help with their education, help the family to frame the difficulties that they're having, and then put them in a position to succeed. So within the PROMISE program here, children not only receive those assessments and then a comprehensive treatment plan that involves, yes, school, but also home and oftentimes those co-occurring mental health needs, but also provide them educational advocacy, which is really incredible. Somebody who will go along to their IEP meetings and get them what they need within the school systems here and sometimes outside of the school systems that are available to them in the public setting. So just wanted to note that and then pivot to introduce Laurie Cutting, who really is a giant in the field. This is going to be a true privilege. So I had the opportunity to overlap with Laurie briefly at Vanderbilt. And it's always an interesting thing to then go back and read somebody's CV. So I had a sense that Professor Cutting was really accomplished, but maybe the degree of that accomplishment was not so obvious because she tends to present herself fairly humbly. So she is the, sorry, I'm going to flip pages. I want to make sure that I get the names right. She is currently the Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Special Education Psychology, Human Development, Radiology, and Pediatrics. At other institutions, she's also been in Neurology and maybe a couple of additional departments. So everyone wants to claim a piece of Professor Cutting, clearly. She was also occupying an additional endowed professorship at Vanderbilt, the Distinguished Professorship at the university level, named after Joe Wyatt. To go back, she did her initial undergraduate work in literature at American University and then went to Northwestern in communication sciences. She did internships at all of the very best places, including Yale and NICHD, as well as Johns Hopkins, where she worked in the Kennedy Krieger Institute. Following her time as a PhD student, she was lured there for a postdoctoral research fellowship and then on faculty, where she rapidly rose to the rank of associate professor. She established her research program there in learning disabilities, including reading, language, as well as executive dysfunction. And then Vanderbilt lured her away in 2009 when I think we first met. She has been incredibly successful at Vanderbilt. She, at the level of the university, was last year named the Mentor of the Year. She has, at the level of grants, more grant funding than I can possibly list, but last year was recognized with an NIH Merit Award. She has now risen within the leadership there to the associate director position in the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, which is one of a couple handfuls of Kennedy centers throughout the country, doing work in developmental disabilities and really emphasizing a focus on learning and cognition there. She truly is a prolific teacher, prolific writer, prolific leader, and prolific researcher. We're going to hear about some of her research today. She's somebody who has published more than 100 publications. We won't hear about all of those today, but we've invited her to provide us a perspective on the cognitive neuroscience of learning, of reading development. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Cutting.
Thank you so much for that incredibly lovely introduction. So I feel like my head is so big, I'm not sure I can get out those two front doors now. I also have to say I'm so delighted to be here because I remember reading DeHirsch's readings in graduate school. So it's really neat to be back here and giving such a lecture. So, and I have to say, I guess those are one of the unnamed institutions. You kind of gave yourself away there, just telling you. Okay, so today, as Jeremy said, I'm going to be talking to you about the cognitive neuroscience of reading development. And just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about. First, I'm going to give you an idea of just sort of what are some of the overview of reading processes. Probably a lot of you remember learning how to read very easily, and so the idea of sort of studying reading, I mean, I remember I felt this way when I was first in graduate school. It was kind of like, yeah, well, you know, people just learn how to read, but not everybody does. So there are probably some people in here who struggled with learning how to read and can appreciate that. So I'm going to go through sort of the model that I'll be thinking about as I go through the talk. Then I'm going to be talking about two different parts of this reading model. The first is the importance of word-level findings, which I'll get into what I mean by that in a second. And then more into the meat of what we think about reading, which is actually learning from reading, learning from what we read. Then I'm going to talk about some intervention findings. So how do we intervene with individuals who are struggling with reading? And then talk about some summary and future direction. So in terms of overview of reading processes, just to kind of have a bird's eye view here, why are reading skills actually important? Well, as probably everybody in this room knows, it's associated with a lot of reading skills are associated with a lot of different outcomes: educational, employment, economic, health outcomes. Things as simple as sort of like how do you read directions from a physician to take medicine properly or do, you know, your treatment properly. Or more simply, as said by someone we all very much appreciate, the more you read, the more things you will know, the more you will learn, the more places you will go. But reading is not necessarily, as I said a few minutes ago, not necessarily easy skill for a lot of people to learn. And as said by John Steinbeck, learning to read is probably the most difficult and revolutionary thing that happens to the human brain, and if you don't believe that, watch an illiterate adult try to do it. How many of you have seen somebody who struggles to learn how to read and watch them either learn how to read or try to read out loud? Yeah, okay, so you can definitely appreciate this. And then in terms of little kids, I also like this quote. Some people who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read is perhaps the greatest single effort that the human undertakes, and he must do so as a child. So I'm thinking John Steinbeck did not learn how to read very easily, because most people who are writers don't actually, you know, feel this way, because they usually are people who kind of just are one of those magical bunch of kids who actually just learn how to read without having to put a whole lot of effort into it. So how are we doing in reading, and is it really something that's problematic to our country and to the world? Well, in terms of our country, it turns out that we're not doing very well. So I don't know how well you can see this. I guess you can probably see it pretty well. So here, this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a nationwide assessment of reading, math, science, writing. But this one is the reading scores. And what it's showing you is that the latest one in 2017, we only have 36% of our nation's, these are fourth graders, and we only have 36% of fourth graders are either reading proficiently or advanced. And everybody else is not reading so great. And in particular, this below basic 32% is really high because those are the kids who are really not getting very basic meaning out of text. So those are the types of kids that are really at risk for struggling on a job application, not being able to read, doctor's notes very well. And so that's a pretty big chunk of kids. And it's the same thing if you look at eighth graders as well. So these same types of statistics. So now that I've depressed you, we'll go into how do children get to be skilled readers and what can go wrong. So behaviorally, we know the characteristics of skilled readers. They can recognize words accurately and fluently, both in and out of context. So if you give somebody who's a skilled reader, a word that's not embedded within a sentence, and you give it to them and ask them to read it out loud, they'll be able to read it just like that. If you give them a fake word that sounds like a real word, so they have to sort of sound it out, use their sound symbol knowledge to sound it out, they'll be able to do that quickly. A lot of times, individuals who are struggling readers, the important reason for why I say in and out of context is that struggling readers, if they're really smart in particular, will be able to figure out how to sound out what the word is just by the context. So you have to really be able to figure out, can they actually read those words out of context as well, not just in context. And that becomes important because when kids are really little, they usually can figure out a lot of words by reading them in context. But the problem is that once they get to be third or fourth grade, if they've been using that strategy, it doesn't work out so well anymore because they're suddenly having to really learn a lot from their text. They're having to use science text to learn new concepts, for example. Kids who are good readers have strong vocabularies. They know how to make inferences and integrate those inferences into existing background knowledge. They employ good strategies, and they have a wide background knowledge. So this is a very common developmental framework for reading. It's called the simple view. And the reason why it's called the simple view is because what this model suggests, as you can see, is that reading consists of two sort of broad strands of cognitive skills. First, you have to be able to recognize those words on the page, as we were just talking about. And those involve sort of some sub-skills down here, which I'll talk about in a second. But then you also have to be able to comprehend or understand sort of the broader language components of reading. And study after study has shown, like over decades and decades, that if you measure somebody's language comprehension, so for example, if you read a story to them, if you measure how well they understood it when you read a story to them, and then you measure how well they're able to recognize those words on the page, words on a page, and you put those two measurements together, you get a pretty accurate representation of how skilled a reader is going to be. And in fact, studies suggest that these two are much better predictors than, for example, just word recognition and IQ. So actually, language comprehension and word recognition are better predictors of how well somebody's going to comprehend than just word recognition and IQ. As you can see, this is an expanded view. When people talk about the simple view, they usually just use the terms language comprehension and word recognition. But there's a lot of things that go into this. And so for language comprehension, some of the things are background knowledge, vocabulary, verbal reasoning, a lot of the things that I just mentioned in the previous slide. In terms of word recognition, the things that are important components of recognizing words are phonological awareness, or your sort of understanding and ability to manipulate the sound structure of the language. A very classic phonological awareness task is say cat without the k sound. So it doesn't involve any reading, it's just your ability to segment phonemes. And the reason why that becomes important as kids get older and why that's a predictor of word recognition is that your first job as a beginning reader is to figure out how do you segment phonemes, which are all co-articulated together, so they don't sound separate, right? When you hear the word cat, you don't hear the three different phonemes of k, at, right? You hear it all together. So if you learn how to segment those phonemes, then it becomes easier to take each phoneme and map it on to its corresponding letter or different types of letters. So in the k sound, for example, you can have C or K that maps onto that. Decoding is what I was mentioning before. If you give somebody a fake word and ask them to sound it out, that is a great measure of how well are they able to apply those basically phonics skills to sounding out novel words that they don't know. So those all go into your abilities to formulate sort of this fast and efficient word recognition processes. And problems can arise at either strand or both. And most commonly, if you come to clinical attention, it's most likely that you have problems in both strands. So in terms of the importance of word level findings, difficulties at this level, the word recognition level or the word level, difficulties at this level cascade to poor reading comprehension. So the idea is if you can't be sounding out the words or recognizing the words on the page, you're going to have an awfully difficult time understanding what they actually mean. And so this is what we refer to sort of classically as dyslexia. And so what does word level processing generally look like in the brain? This is a very simplistic model. There's more complexity to it, but just to be sort of in the very basic sense, studies over the last couple of decades have shown that there's a more left hemisphere than right hemisphere involvement. If you ask somebody to read words in a scanner, you're going to find that there's activity in the left hemisphere, as I said, more than right. And you're going to see predominantly three different regions. One of those regions is in the temporoparietal area, which is thought to be important for mapping orthographic to phonological representations. And then there's a frontal area that has sort of been a matter of debate in terms of whether it's an area that's impaired, whether it's an area that is either overactivated or underactivated in dyslexia. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then there's this area here, the occipital temporal region, which is the most sort of hallmark area that lights up always. So if you put somebody in a scanner, you ask them to read words, you're going to see this area light up. And the idea is that over development, there tends to be a consolidation from these areas to this sort of more consolidated area of this left occipital temporal region, which is thought to be sort of reflective of your rapid and efficient word level processing. Individuals who have dyslexia show pretty much universally underactivation in this area. They also show some anomalies in these other regions as well, but this is a very, very well-established finding that you'll see underactivation in this left occipital temporal region. So, as I just mentioned, if you look at activation in this left occipital temporal region, this is just one example. There's been this is a study we happen to do, but there's lots and lots and lots of studies and meta-analyses and things like that that have showed that there is this well-established finding of lower activation in individuals with dyslexia. So here, what you're seeing is in this particular area, when we showed individuals words, when they were in the scanner and we looked at their brain activity, we see that there's lower signal for individuals with dyslexia as compared to those who are typically developing. There's also studies that show that there are anomalies in white matter connections from this left occipital temporal region. And this is this picture is actually from Jason Yateman's laboratory, but the findings I'm about to show you are from a study that we did in 2014. And in our study, what we did is we took that left occipital temporal region that I showed you that was active, that's always active when you show individuals words, And we looked at the white matter connections. So in this instance, we're not looking at activity, we're actually looking at microstructural, sort of structural properties. And so we asked the question from this left occipital temporal region, where do we see white matter tracks connecting to? And what we found in this particular study was we found that individuals who were typically developing showed a lot more connectivity to areas that are traditional language areas, left inferior, middle, and superior temporal gyri on the left-hand side. So there was a lot more connections as compared to those with who had dyslexia. Conversely, the individuals with dyslexia showed a lot more connectivity from the left occipital temporal region to more basic visual cortex areas. And so for any of you that are interested in the exact differences, that's where they were found. Okay, so I've talked about those findings, which are well known in the literature in terms of the left occipital region being important for word recognition. But the issue that we've studied in our lab and have gotten particularly intrigued in is what else is there besides reading? Because a lot of people have studied this left occipital temporal region. They've studied what word level processing looks like in the brain, but we really kind of wanted to know, what does it look like when you have to actually comprehend? What are all the other things going on? And I'll say from the start, I have no idea why this interested me. It was a bad idea because it's super complicated, and it would have been a lot easier to just focus on the word level thing. But anyway, I've gone off on this adventure for the last 10 or 15 years, so I think I'm stuck there. But anyway, one illustration of sort of where we see individuals who are struggling and how there's differences in the brain. So if we take individuals, like I just showed you before, we have the typically developing individuals. We have those with dyslexia. But then there's a third group that people study, and those are individuals who have specific reading comprehension deficits. So these are individuals that are perfectly normal in their word level processing. So they're able to sound out words, they're able to recognize words, but they nonetheless have trouble comprehending what they're reading. And so the question is why is that? That's one question. But early on, this was, at this point 6 years ago, but when we first started doing these studies, there was a question of, they may appear like they have perfectly normal word level processing, but do they actually have normal word level processing when you look into their brains? And so this was a study that we did 6 years ago where we asked the question, if you take individuals who have specific reading comprehension deficits, do they show that nice, robust activation in this left occipital temporal area, or do they look more like dyslexics? Because it's possible that they just have figured out, some other way to compensate for their word level processing or some other word level processing deficits or something like that. So in this study, we showed that actually they do have very comparable activity in this left occipital temporal region when they're processing word level stimuli. So just sort of providing some nice basis, it provided the foundation for us to say, okay, we're going to go look for other candidate things that might go wrong when people struggle with comprehension besides just this word level processing issue. So what are some findings beyond the word level, and what else is involved with reading comprehension? So as I just said a second ago, despite the importance of word level processing, it doesn't fully explain reading comprehension performance, and this is particularly true as children get older. So when kids are young, if you measure their word level processing, it accounts for a huge amount of their reading comprehension. So it pretty much explains like 70% of their reading comprehension. But as kids get older, and again, they're having to do more things with texts, like understand new science concepts or understand, history or learn new historical facts and things like that, you start to see that this word level processing drops way, way off in terms of how well it explains reading comprehension. And so we have to look for these other sources of difficulty, Because remember, the statistics I showed you earlier, that we have 32% of kids who can't really read very well at all in 4th and 8th grade, and 60% who are not even meeting proficiency levels. So, but not all of that is going to be due to their word level difficulties. So not all of them are going to be due to having dyslexia, for example. So in our focus of looking at reading comprehension, we've taken the approach that we're, of course, looking at word level processing when we're trying to understand reading comprehension, because that's a piece of it. But then we've also taken a neurobiological sort of point of view and framework. And so we tend to look at word level processing, language processes, and executive function. And the areas that we most often look at within executive function are inhibition, working memory, and shifting. There's a lot of different models of executive function, as probably most of you in this audience know. There's a lot of different ways that people look at it. But this is the framework that most commonly we've sort of, it's a very common framework, and certainly encapsulates some of the major executive function processes. Now, in terms of definitions of executive function, as I mentioned, there are a lot of different processes thought to be involved in executive function, and therefore, of course, that means there's different definitions. But I like this definition. This is Adele Diamond's definition: a family of effortful top-down processes needed when you have to concentrate and pay attention when going on automatic or relying on instinct or intuition would be ill-advised, insufficient, or impossible. So I think this really nicely captures what you need when you're employing executive function processes. So how does this play a role in explaining reading comprehension? Remember, we talked about very early on the fact that you have to employ strategies such as visualization. You have to be able to make inferences. You have to integrate it into background knowledge. And so our hypothesis was that it would also play a role in predicting reading comprehension. And so this is a study that we did in 2012. And what I'm showing you here is just looking at what we put in to explain, to predict reading comprehension in this sample of 126 kids, about 12 years old, mean age. We looked at the components of the simple view. So this is word level processing, this is language abilities. So we took those two sort of strands of the rope that I showed you earlier and put them in as predictors of reading comprehension. And not surprisingly, they account for the bulk of reading comprehension, because remember I told you they were great predictors. But then you see that inferential language, so sort of a higher level piece of language, as well as executive function, in this case it was a measure of shifting, also accounts for a significant amount in reading comprehension. So this was a nice finding back then, and a number of studies have also shown that this is true, that these different components of executive function contribute to reading comprehension. But one of the things that we were particularly interested in was, does executive function, we thought it probably contributed to reading comprehension because of what's involved in reading comprehension, but we were also curious if it mattered what type of text you were reading. Like, does it matter if you're reading expository text or otherwise known as informational text, like science text or history, where you're kind of having to actively integrate new knowledge with old knowledge? Or does it play a differential role when you're trying to process narrative text or stories, which involve sort of more socio-emotional processing? And so what we found was that actually there is quite a bit of a difference. In narrative text, you need these two components of the simple view, but there actually wasn't, in this measure of executive function, there actually wasn't much of a contribution to executive function explaining narrative text or stories. But there was for expository text. So that overall finding here was really driven by the demands that expository text place on executive function. Now, you might say, is that just because expository text is harder than narrative text? And I've given this part of this talk so many times, and what I'm about to tell you is so counterintuitive. So just bear with me if I get it wrong. So this is an analysis this is a way you can analyze actual text, okay? Like actually how difficult a text is. So the easiest things to think about are sort of like, if you have more sentences, it's probably a harder text. If you have more words, it's probably a harder text. Down here, connectives, which is reflective of how much does each sentence link with the past sentence. So how much does it really refer to probably one of the easier examples would be, rather than saying like, so Mary drank the water and then she spilled it, or saying Mary drank the water and then Mary spilled it. So then, you're very clear on who it was who spilled it. So that's sort of one example of that. So what you actually see when you analyze these texts of narrative and expository stories versus informational text is that the narrative text is actually easier text, which you would not predict, right? Because you have executive function is I know everybody's giving these. I always have to like process this because it's a weird thing. So narrative text is actually harder text if you look at these instances. It has more sentences, it has more words, it has fewer connectives, and this is sort of another measure of connectivity. But it actually is it's harder text, yet it does not have as many demands on executive function. So it's not just driven by text difficulty. And this is an area that we've gotten quite interested in as of late. And I'm just going to show you some findings from a manuscript that's under re-review right now that sort of really got us very intrigued in this issue. So this is a study where we looked at the processing of narrative and expository text in the scanner. And then we asked the question of where were there differences between narrative and expository text. And where we find differences is that we find that expository text actually shows more activation in a network classically associated with executive function, the frontoparietal network. So that's good because it matches our behavioral findings. So expository text shows more activation in this executive function network than narrative text does. Interestingly, the narrative text shows more activation in the default mode network, which is associated with things like theory of mind and sort of more that sort of socio-emotional type processing than expository text. So it makes sense, but it is an interesting sort of area that we've adventured off into, and we're currently writing a grant on this. Now, why does this actually matter? Well, it matters because generally kids do a lot worse on expository text than narrative overall. If you took those National Assessment of Educational Progress texts and you divided them into narrative and expository and asked how well do people do on those, if you look at how well people are learning new information, it gets a lot worse. So they're much more easily able to understand narrative texts than they are expository texts. So the question then now is sort of what are the properties of the narrative texts that make it easier to learn from them? And remember them, and why is expository text harder? And so we're headed off into that direction. And I'm happy to answer some questions afterwards about our different thoughts about why that is. Okay, so from the findings that I've showed you so far, we've kind of come up with this idea that yes, we have language comprehension and word recognition that are important, but we also see that executive function seems to play a role in reading comprehension. And the way that we've sort of thought about it is that executive function, you have all these different pieces that kind of have to weave together to be a skilled reader. And our thought is that executive function is actually helping those pieces kind of weave together over development. And so we have a number of different studies where we're trying to look at the issue of exactly where does executive function play a role and how does it play a role, and is it the case that it's actually sort of helping to intertwine these different skills. One of the ways that we've tried to understand the role of executive function is actually directly looking at the neurobiological correlates of reading at the word level versus the passage or comprehension level, which I'm going to refer to as word versus discourse level. So discourse is just, the comprehension level. And so I showed you this model before of what word level processing looks like in the brain. And the importance of this left occipital temporal region. But language has a sort of, when you look at broader language or sort of thinking about something that would be more akin to what's going on in that upper strand and what's mapping onto the brain, you see that there's different areas, some different, some overlapping areas that are involved. So this is adapted from an overview paper of analyzing sort of a lot of different language studies that Price et al. Did in 2012. But they came up with this sort of model of these different areas being involved in language processing. And you notice some of them are similar, so the temporal parietal region. But rather than it being an area that's important for cementing orthographic and phonological, letters and sounds together, instead it's thought to be important for semantic memory and prediction and coherence building. So sort of putting the whole picture together when you're hearing connected language. The inferior frontal area is thought to be important for executive semantic control. So sort of having this sort of more specialized executive function involved in when you're trying to understand meaning. And then you have some other areas which you can read right there on the slide, so I won't read them to you. But my main point to all this is that language regions are multifunctional. And this is going to become important as I go through this next study that we did in 2016. So in this study, we had 37 right-handed adolescent individuals, and their mean age was about 12. They had a range of word reading ability. So they were within the typical range on that bottom strand of the rope that I've talked about, but we allowed their reading comprehension to vary. But we wanted them to have at least sort of basic word level efficiency. And what we did in the scanner was we were trying to capture, as I said, both the word level and the discourse level. And so what we had them do was a paradigm where we showed them, so they're lying in the scanner and they're seeing one slide at a time. So in this particular case, this was a passage about hydroponics. And these were all expository passages, by the way. So this sentence, hydroponics, is a funny word, four plants growing without soil. And then you'd see another sentence about hydroponics. So it would be a whole long passage teaching you about hydroponics. And we picked topics that are obscure, so that it was likely that people would not know a whole lot about it until after, past the first sentence. They probably wouldn't know a whole lot about the topic, and that they would learn new information about it. And for the most part, they just saw these slides presented, one at a time, and there were no repeats. But every once in a while we threw in a repeat, not very often. We threw a repeat slide. And can anybody guess why we did that? What'd you say? Yes, because a lot of times people, when they're doing adult work and they study, there's a lot of people who have studied they've studied comprehension processes with adults, and they don't necessarily worry about, are the adults actually reading the words? Well, kids actually, believe it or not, fall asleep in the scanner, which I don't understand how anybody could fall asleep in an MRI scanner because it's so loud and so uncomfortable. But we've had more than one person fall asleep in the scanner. So, but anyway, but the idea is that, we're making sure that they actually are really paying attention and reading the words. And so that's the passages part of the paradigm. And then the word part of the paradigm, we have the kids just read these words, and they don't come together to make any coherent passage. You're not learning from them. We're just asking them to read the words. So the idea is that we're trying to measure sort of words that, we're just trying to get at that sort of basic word recognition decoding level, that bottom strand of the rope slide I showed you, and then what happens when you're comprehending the whole thing. So well, you can see the data collection, the scan protocol for those of you who might be interested, but again, we had this basic sort of attention task throughout, but only 8% of the stimuli. So what we got, as you can probably imagine, is that there were a lot of areas of overlap, which we were expecting, of course, that words, which you don't see very many of them, but there's a few areas where you see this orange, and those are areas where words showed more activation than passages. But for the most part, they overlapped a whole lot. And when you're actually being required to comprehend and learn from the passages, you see some unique activation, as denoted in the red. Well, people have done paradigms sort of similar to this before, where they've wanted to isolate comprehension above and beyond this word level and sort of ask the question, like, what is going on with comprehension? We actually looked at this and we thought, there's something sort of interesting here that we'd like to do. We see that there's some, areas that are more active for passages than words, and that's interesting, and you would expect it because you're being asked to comprehend and so on and so forth, and some of the areas made a whole lot of sense and had been, shown before. But we thought what would be very interesting would be, and I'm sorry, then these are the actual areas where passages were greater than words, and just sort of illustrating. And again, these are areas that people had shown before. But what we were really interested in was trying to understand what these overlap regions might mean and whether kids are doing the same thing, like what is actually happening when you're reading words and passages. Are you actually using the same processes? Is your brain coordinating with the same areas when you're reading words versus passages? And so what we did is we took the areas that were overlapping, we took 3 different areas. We took one area associated with word recognition. So in that left occipital temporal region, this is just a different viewpoint, but that left occipital temporal region we know is important for word level processing. Then we took areas that we know are important for semantic processing or knowledge of words, meanings of words. And then we took an area that is associated with executive function processing. And so we took each one of these areas that were purposefully overlapping, and we asked the question, as I mentioned, the typical interpretation is that these shared regions must be performing the same function. But we thought, well, shared regions may have different functions for word recognition and reading comprehension, even though both of them are reading tasks. And so how we tackled this issue is we looked at connectivity from each one of these regions. So if we go back here for a second. So in this region, this left occipital temporal region, which is always active when people are being asked to read words in the scanner, we asked, what is this area correlating with? What other areas of the brain is this area correlating with when people are asked to read words versus when they're reading passages? And so what we found for this left occipital temporal region was that when individuals were being asked to read words, there was a correlation with the left middle temporal gyrus, which is known to be important for phonological processing, among other things. But this exact region, for those of you who are familiar with Neuroscience, which has a whole bunch of different functional neuroimaging studies in it, if you put in the coordinates for this, the first thing that pops up is phonological processing. When you look at where it's coordinating with when you're asked to read passages and to be understanding passages, it correlates with left language regions, including the left angular gyrus. And so same place, both asking them to read, but one of in one task you're just looking at the words, and the other one you're learning from reading. This, furthermore, was modulated by an out-of-scanner decoding measure. So this coupling got even tighter depending on whether it got tighter if you were better at decoding. In terms of the semantic seeds, what you see is that these semantic seeds overlapped with the left occipital temporal region, so they coupled with the left occipital temporal region in terms of activity when you're being asked to read words. When you're asked to understand passages, they correlated with the left angular gyrus. Again, this area that's important for sort of building coherent meaning. And then finally, if you look at this area that is been connected, it's sort of right along the inferior frontal sulcus, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex area. It looks like it's like completely in the inferior frontal gyrus, but it's not actually. It's actually sort of right along the sulcus going into the middle frontal gyrus. And that area, which has been associated with working memory predominantly, correlates with the left middle temporal gyrus. Again, that area important for phonological processing during passages, and same area of left angular gyrus during passage reading. And then this connection they were more tightly coupled the better you were at reading comprehension. So looking at this sort of even to a further degree, we wanted to ask this question about what is this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, inferior frontal sulcus region that's sort of this domain general executive function region? What is it actually doing in passages? And how does it help actually coordinate different skills? And so what we did is we did an analysis where we looked at what happens when you have a 1 unit increase in this area. When this area has a 1 unit increase of activation, what happens in terms of linkages with the angular, where does the angular gyrus connect to? And so what you see is with this 1 unit increase in this executive function regions, there's increased coupling between this left angular gyrus, that area that kept showing up over and over and over again in all 3 of the other analyses I showed you. There's more connection between this area and an area linked to an area that is part of this left occipital temporal region. It's a little bit lower than some of the other left occipital temporal regions I'm showing you, but sort of same with, but within the territory of that word recognition area. So the thought is sort of perhaps that this working memory executive function region, is it actually sort of playing a role in facilitating connections between different language areas that we know are important for reading? Which is kind of interesting, because if you think about what you see often clinically with kids who have learning issues, is that you'll see sometimes that those executive function strengths can help individuals overcome learning difficulties. And so this sort of, to me, is suggestive of perhaps that phenomena that I have often seen with kids who are able to respond well to intervention, or who have, really terrible word recognition deficits, but somehow are still able to comprehend. So this is sort of suggested that maybe this could be a mechanism for kids who are struggling readers. And I think I'm going to skip this because I've said most of it already. In terms of thinking about this, in terms of predicting intervention, if we go right to this point that I was talking about, does executive function play any role in sort of coordinating regions? We actually looked at this in terms of responsiveness to intervention. How am I doing on time? Doing fine?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
Oh, yeah, I'll be done in 15 minutes. Okay, so if you take this idea of, well, let me back up for 1 second. So studies show that intervention responsiveness, so those kids who are struggling readers, that intervention, if you give them reading intervention, how well they respond to that reading intervention, how much they become better readers after getting intensive reading instruction. That is related to their language skills and attention issues. There's also been a number of studies that have shown that the brain changes as reading gets better. So this is just purely for illustrative purposes, but this is sort of representative of what a number of studies have showed. If you take good readers and you compare to them poor readers, you can see that there's differences in those language regions and differences in activity. This is if you're showing them those words in the scanner. You should be seeing that left occipital temporal activation, nice robust activation. You should be seeing this temporal parietal activation. So you see that in good readers. Poor readers, you don't really see it, right? But then after they have intervention, you'll see that their activities is much more similar to those of good readers. And lots of studies have showed this. Again, this is really just for illustrative purposes. This is actually just a single subject, but just to make the point that we see that the brain changes as kids get to be better readers. But there's also studies that suggest that the brains of those who respond to reading instruction versus those who don't may have neurobiological differences before intervention starts that can predict response. So Fumiko Huft, who I know was a previous speaker here, she has some nice work where she's shown that before individuals receive intervention, if their brain is structured or functions in a certain way, then you can predict intervention response or growth of reading over time. Actually, I'm sorry, hers wasn't actually intervention response, it was growth in reading in those who are struggling readers over time. Most of the studies have shown that what you see, if you look at those who respond versus those who don't respond, what you tend to see is that those who do not respond have lower activation in this left occipital temporal region before they start intervention. And so the ones that don't respond after you've done all this nice reading tutoring with them and they're still poor readers, they started off with lower activation here. So even if these two responder, non-responder groups had actually equal levels starting with, they were equally poor at reading. If individuals had more activation in this left occipital temporal area, they were more likely to actually grow in their reading skills after receiving reading tutoring. So we took this a step further and wanted to apply some of the framework of what I just finished showing you in the passage level and word level processing findings. So in this study, we had 22 individuals with dyslexia. We had individuals who were typically developing readers, and then we actually had a waitlist control group. And individuals got pre-testing. They got functional MRI, structural MRI, reading, attention, executive function tests. And then what we did is individuals with dyslexia received intervention based on Orton-Gillingham principles, so sort of based on very standard, well-known approaches to teaching individuals who struggle with reading. They received this Orton-Gillingham-based intervention, and then we divided that group after they received intervention into those who responded to the intervention and those who didn't respond to the intervention. And then we did post-testing. And then with the typically developing readers, of course, they didn't receive any intervention, neither did those who were in the waitlist control group. What I'm focusing on talking about today in terms of the study is these fMRI findings before they received intervention and how these fMRI findings predict whether they ended up being responders or non-responders. So these are descriptive statistics of the different groups. The big thing that I want to point out is that by definition, the individuals who ended up being non-responders, as denoted by DIS-NR, did not show any changes in their reading scores at the word level. This is all word level findings right now that I'm talking about. Those who responded showed about a third of a standard deviation growth in reading. One of the things that actually I didn't say a second ago, if you notice, those of you who do intervention, this is a very short intervention. It's only 15 hours. And I can answer questions as to why we did that afterwards if anybody is interested. But we were pleased with this level of response, for such a short intervention. Okay, so what did we find? We confirmed the previous findings that in this left occipital temporal region, the individuals who responded, they have more activation than those who don't respond, and more similar to those who are typically developing, but not quite as robust. But what we were really interested in was connectivity between regions and how connectivity might predict response. And so one of our findings was that we found that the individuals who responded as compared to those who didn't respond had greater connectivity between an area in the left middle temporal gyrus and right inferior frontal gyrus. And what's interesting about that is that it overlaps with the area that Fumiko Huft has shown can predict intervention response. So how well these two areas were coordinating with each other pre-intervention predicted intervention response. So in terms of those, in terms of sort of looking at more of that interactive component and whether the executive function or dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and how that may play a role in facilitating connections between language regions, what we found was that if you looked at this left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and asked, again, with 1 unit increase in this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, what is this area correlating with more, and what is this area correlating with more? You see that with 1 unit increase in this executive function area, there's more correlation between 2 language areas known to be important for reading, as well as to the left and right inferior frontal gyrus. So both sort of areas that have been implicated in reading. So, and the thing that's interesting about this is that these statistics, they made us take us out in the paper, actually, unfortunately, but if you pull the actually sort of summary statistics from these analyses, what you show is that these metrics can actually predict whether you're going to respond or not respond to intervention with about 95% accuracy. So it was really, really high. And so it sort of goes along with our sort of thought that perhaps this executive function region is playing a role in facilitating bringing language areas together, and that if you have this ability to bring in your executive function, then maybe that's going to facilitate your responsiveness to intervention. I do want to put the disclaimer here that this is really fundamentally still based all on correlational analyses, and we all know that correlation is not causality. So that's why I keep using the word suggestive, things like that. Okay, so in terms of predicting responsiveness, I'm almost done, by the way. Almost done, I promise. The dyslexics who were responders, they made significant word level gains compared to those who were non-responders. That was by definition. Even though on pre-intervention, I didn't actually point this out, but they were similar in word level measures. They were both equally poor at word level reading. We see these connectivity differences and critically suggestive that there may be a facilitatory role for the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in those who are responders as compared to non-responders. Now, this gets into an interesting thing, which I'm sure, given this is sort of more in the psychiatry realm, there's these interesting studies by Cole et al. That get into this idea that the executive function networks may be sort of play this role of kind of being an immune system of the mind. And so this idea is that the executive function involvement across disorder suggests that maybe a healthy executive function network regulates other neural systems in a goal-directed manner. And this can be in both typical and pathological states. And and therefore that worse clinical outcomes can reflect both this sort of primary disease-specific neural deficit, which may be, again, sort of related to this left occipital temporal region. There may be some primary tissue anomalies there that give rise to reading difficulties. But it could also reflect a secondary failure of executive function networks coming in and directing these vulnerable systems. And so the idea is that readers with high intervention response may have more intact executive support of the reading network than non-responsive readers. And I think, how much more time do we? 2 or 3 minutes. I don't know if I can cover. I'll try to start to cover this, and if I can't, we'll just move on. Actually, you know what? I think I will just move towards the end, and we can come back to that at some point if we want to. But just to kind of summarize, sort of some of the implications, can we predict very early who will be at risk for reading difficulties? And I didn't talk about this, but with my collaborator, Gavin Price, we've been doing some math work as well. And can we predict these long before trouble arises? Some of Nadine Gabb's work certainly suggests that that is the case. What would be really nice is knowing not just who is going to have reading difficulties, but more importantly, knowing who will respond to reading intervention long before starting a certain intervention approach. One of the things that we always talk about in our lab is, will these neuroimaging measures actually ever be better than many of the things we already know? So, for example, we know that predictors of reading failure, that there's a very strong predictive component of if you have somebody else in your family who has trouble with reading, if you talk late, there's a lot of really good observational or behavioral measurements that you can use that are pretty good predictors of whether you're going to have reading problems. I don't think we have very good predictors of intervention response or approach and how that might work. So it may be helpful in terms of thinking about that. In terms of our current and future directions, we're just focusing on further understanding the construct of reading comprehension, particularly this narrative and expository differences, by examining reader text and reader-text interactions. We've just got a new grant to focus on the neurobiological characteristics of responders and non-responders. That's actually the merit award that Jeremy mentioned. And so we're looking at how the neurobiological correlates of executive function, particularly not just executive function, but how executive function is coordinating with more skill-specific areas and how that may predict academic growth. And then understanding this expository and narrative text. And so with that, I will close. I want to acknowledge our funding sources and all the different institutes and entities that help support our work, and most importantly to my students and many collaborators, because of course this work does not happen in a vacuum. There's lots of other people that you work with to make this happen. So thank you.
All right, is this working? No. You know the magic. Very rare you ask your chair for AV help. So I must say this is really a lovely presentation, and it strikes me that you're presenting a model where, in some ways, the thing we know most about, sort of the decoding piece, is the simplest. And there are these layers where decoding and then language comprehension, and then sort of above that, executive function, as if you decode the word, you understand how you interpret language to understand your world, and then the understand your world is sort of that executive function level. I wonder, in part this is spurred by the fact that if you walk by our LCD screens, you see CBT for executive function pretty frequently. I wonder, I'm sure you're thinking about this all the time, but to what extent should we already be trying to intervene for executive function in these kids who are having difficulty? Where's the promise there? What's known? Where might we go with that?
Yeah, so there, I didn't mention this, but I think that's a great question. So there are a number of meta-analyses that have looked at executive function training and how direct executive function training may or may not transfer into improved reading and math skills. And most of those meta-analyses show that there's no transfer. So people get better at executive function, but they don't get better at reading or math. Now, there's some really interesting newer neuroimaging studies that have come out that have looked at executive function tasks. So in our study, we didn't have an executive function task. We just looked at reading. So the kids were reading, and then we looked at executive function areas. Jack Fletcher's group has looked at taken some similar approaches, not so much with connectivity, but looked at executive function areas both, but they also have an executive function task. So, and what they've shown is that activation during the executive function task shows no relationship to reading, basically, no relationship to reading outcomes. I mean, that may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but, it doesn't do much in terms of predicting reading outcomes. That same area, though, I can't remember exactly where it is, but let's just say it's dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's somewhere within sort of the executive function network. So if you look at dorsolateral prefrontal cortex while you're performing an executive function task and take that activation and ask how well does it predict reading outcomes, it doesn't. You take that same area of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex while somebody's performing a reading task and ask how well does that predict outcomes, and it predicts it great. So, and then the same thing has actually been shown in math. So the idea is really that not that executive function isn't important to reading or math, but that you sort of have this paradox of like the pure executive function tasks don't really seem to work in terms of prediction, but then you have these areas within executive function while you're reading or doing math that actually are highly predictive. And so how do you resolve those things? And so the grant, the merit award that I was talking about, what that grant hypothesizes is that when you're doing executive function training, you're just training your executive function networks. When you're doing reading training, reading intervention, you're just doing your reading intervention. But what you need to do is figure out how to connect the two. And so it's the connection that's actually going to matter, not the actual activation. Well, activation matters somewhat too, but it's the connection that becomes really critical.
Right. Yeah, layers of complexity there, and I think opportunities, but we'll move on to another question.
Such an interesting presentation. It really made me think about, particularly the part about narrative and expository, made me think about Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences and concepts of health and dysfunction. Plenty of kids who are like kind of all smart when they're really little, but they get to middle school or high school, and some of them start to get told that they're not so smart, say in science, that kind of thing, and they start to have difficulties. What you're showing to some extent might indicate not that they're not smart or having difficulty or that they need an intervention, but they have different brains and different ways of processing things. There's a very different way of talking to people about things that affects things like self-esteem and self-esteem development, and could potentially even indicate not that they need intervention, but that they, if you could identify it early on, that they need coaching as to what type of higher schooling they need. Because you can learn science in different ways. Some of it's more narrative than other. Right. So I wonder about that in terms of beginning to, correlate with that type of multiple intelligences idea, and to think about different types of health and different types of schooling that might be better for some kids than others.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in terms of thinking about like narrative expository texts, because, right, you can take a lot of things and make a story out of them, which for a lot of people would be much more captivating and interesting. And we actually have some findings just from like 3 days ago, where we took expository and narrative text and looked at measures of arousal and valence of the words. So sort of like, I don't know, maybe emotionality of the, I'm not really sure like how exactly is the right sort of way to capture that, but it's certainly more in the sort of emotional realm than it is like in the, straight cognitive phonological processing realm. And it's very interesting because kids do better on expository texts that have higher arousal and valence, words that are more arousing and have higher valence scores than those that don't. So just sort of suggestive, I think, of kind of what you're talking about. I mean, that's sort of like super preliminary kind of findings, but we thought that was sort of interesting because like after controlling for all sorts of other text characteristics, it's showing that it kind of like if you tap into those systems, that for some people that's really gonna, it really seems to make a pretty big difference. So yeah, I mean, there's this whole thought about neurodiversity, right, that we have to be, a lot of people are thinking about.
I have a question that I'm still trying to completely formulate, but I guess I'll give you the pieces and see if we can come up with a question. So, and it's sort of following a little bit up on what Deborah said, and that is that reading is purely learned, right? It's sort of this abstract concept. And so who struggles with reading and who doesn't struggle with reading may also have something to do with how reading is taught. And there was an article in the New York Times recently that went on about how we're teaching reading all wrong. So I'm wondering if and you'd shown a slide earlier that said, like, more than half of the kids are having problems reading, but I'm assuming not more than half of the kids are having the dyslexia problems you're describing, right? So I'm wondering if the kinds of findings that you're finding in terms of the difficulty reading vary in different places where maybe reading is taught differently, or across different languages where some are more phonetic and some are not. And so I'm wondering how much of what you've described is specific to a particular context and way that reading is taught. I don't know, maybe you can take it from there.
So I think those are super like awesome questions, and sort of like I think it's the $64 million question. I mean, that's kind of like the brass ring, right? Is trying to understand what's the difference between the way you were taught versus, what's organic versus what's environmental, and how those things interact. What I didn't mention that is very important to mention is that there are certain ways that we know that you should teach people how to read, and that if you don't teach them that way, you're going to have a lot more people who have reading problems. Where environmental sort of like, I guess in the sense of what I mean by environmental, like where like teaching approach starts and stops, and sort of it's like you're truly got some neurobiological anomaly. I mean, those lines, well, first of all, those lines are going to be super fuzzy no matter what, right? But I don't think anybody knows them yet. But I think it's a great question. There was something else I was going to say about that. I can't remember. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, it is something that I think we're going to be, the field grapples with all the time.
I'm sorry that I missed part of your talk, but I have two questions. One is, so for those of us that aren't, really steeped in the area of pediatric cognitive disorders or learning disability, it seems that there's well, the question really is, how well defined is the kind of nosologic landscape with respect? So you're studying some varieties of dyslexia. There's also learning disabilities, a broader rubric.
Right.
There's ADHD. There's NVLD. How well defined is the nosology of the different forms of these pediatric cognitive disturbances or abnormalities or different ways of functioning?
It's sort of like everything's relative kind of question. Let me ask you a question. What would you say is something that is well defined?
Mood disorders, psychotic disorders, anxiety disorders, substance abuse.
So I'd say it's probably, I mean, I'm not an expert in those areas, but I would say it's probably akin to that. I think that they probably do fall in that sort of same level of knowledge. There's continuums on all of those, unless I'm mistaken. I think everything you mentioned, there's continuums, and just like that, there's continuums in all these different learning disorders and categories and subcategories of them. I don't know. There might be people who disagree. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, so. You don't have to answer this, but it seems to me that given the known, or suspected prevalence of these conditions, very little is done as a policy basis or systematically done in the educational system and the primary care system to screen, identify, and then follow up on those. You can just nod your head yes or no. The second question is...
I don't know if you heard the big sigh that came out, like,
Yeah, well, welcome to our world.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess it's sort of funny, right? You know, people don't care how you feel or whether you learn anything, right?
Oh, the
It's not really that important for life, is it? But
juvenile correctional systems, so I'm told, are sort of chock full of individuals that have
Yes.
these conditions. The other question is, I was at the University of North Carolina before I came here, and there was a guy there named Mel Levine,
yes,
who gained notoriety with, I think, a different kind of one mind at a time kind of approach. And he obviously was a smooth talker and charismatic, and ended up, you know, suffering a bad fate. But
Yes.
I mean, is this a field that's sort of vulnerable to that kind of thing?
a field that's vulnerable to what kind of thing? People being smooth talkers?
To snake oil salesmen, to people who are not
Snake oil?
conducting, evidence-based work and proffering treatments or remedies. I mean, I had people calling me up saying, "Can you get me in to see Dr. Levine? He's like the only person that Charles Schwab gave him $50 million, Richard
Right.
Branson." So, I mean,
So, I mean, there's certainly, yes, I do think that there's a lot of snake oil types of things out there for learning issues. And, we get calls all the time about that. And, the different organizations like the International Dyslexia Association and NCLD, the National Center for Learning Disabilities, like they grapple with these issues all the time of like sort of how to deal with the snake oil kind of phenomenon. I was going to mention something about the juvenile delinquent thing because there are some interesting studies that show that if you give intervention to individuals who are in the juvenile system, if you give reading intervention to them, because so many of them have really bad reading abilities, if you give reading intervention to them, the recidivism rate is dramatically lower. I think it's sort of interesting, but who knows? Like probably some of it has to do with reading, but probably also a lot of it has to do with, attention level that you've been giving the kids and things like that. But I do have to say that, speaking of snake oil people, so we were having this conversation right before we came here. I'm reading this book, Bad Blood. I don't know if anybody's read this book, but it's about, you know what, I actually don't remember. He's a Wall Street Journal reporter. I don't remember his name, but it's about Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos, the blood prick. So, as soon as you said that snake oil thing, I was thinking, well, you know what? These people who are like, major advisors to the president and all this other stuff, and Senate, they were, the guy who like helped build Google and all this. They were
but
they fell to the snake oil too.
yeah, except don't go there because
Okay.
in business, it's a whole different set of standards. It's a whole different, their goal is to make money.
It's
And
true.
even if they make money on a lie, in her case, the problem was that it was in the life sciences business. But if she was doing
Yes.
it in Wall Street, nobody would have blinked an eye.
It's really scary stuff.
A question in back over here. Oh. So thank you so much for that
Oh.
presentation. You've got me really thinking about this connection between executive functioning and reading. And so there's three trends I've seen with a lot of the adolescents that I work with that I'm wondering you could comment on how they're impacting reading. One is the shift from longer form reading to short form reading. New Yorker Post versus BuzzFeed articles. The second is the way language now incorporates emojis and GIFs. A lot of my teenagers incorporate that, so there's more of a social emotional piece in their text messages and writing.
Yeah.
And the last is a greater demands on our attention from notifications and how difficult it is to maintain executive functioning when you're reading. So how do you see some of these larger cultural changes in how we communicate, how we read, impacting language and reading comprehension?
There are people who actually study that. There's a great new book by Marianne Wolf that just came out. It's called something like Reading in the Digital Age, I think. What? Reader come home. So I have to say, like, I'm gonna refer you to that book because this it's not an area that I have too much expertise in, but I do need to read her book. So.
Actually, my question is along the same lines. Those of us who work downtown see a lot of lawyers, and one of the complaints they have is that they can't read books like novels or anything that's long. They may be expert at massaging a whole bunch of papers and finding the vulnerable exposures and picking that out. So they're highly skilled, and they also have high executive function. But over the years, they've developed this kind of focal attention to particular things, and they can't read contexts, especially emotional contexts. So what I'm actually asking is does the way you use reading develop you into a completely different reader? And then, of course, this has to do with the kids with their cell phones and their emojis and everything.
Right. So I don't think we know that. Again, I think that sort of gets back to that interplay of environment and instruction. One of the questions that we have actually is just sort of along those lines. You know, people don't think about reading as sort of developing socio-emotional kinds of skills and sort of the importance perhaps of narrative text and things like that in curriculum. But I'm thinking that maybe there's a lot more importance to that than maybe we give credit for.
Jeremy? Can I ask? Oh. Hi. So I have two questions. One is, did you look at hyperlexic kids with poor social comprehension, and have they been looked at? So kids who didn't have the word issues but struggle with the social comprehension. And then my second question is, and this is the dark side of me, does it look like pharmaceutical industries are going to be interested in supporting some of this research to enhance executive functions in individuals who have persistent LD? Because I've actually medicated some youngsters who did not really meet criteria for ADHD when they had Orton-Gillingham for 2 years straight and were still unable to read, and anecdotally, it has really helped them.
Your first question? What was your first question?
Was about hyperlexic kids
hyperlexic,
with
that's
poor
right,
social
okay.
comprehension and their functional MRIs.
So we have not done anything with individuals who sort of, we have studied kids who have specific comprehension problems who don't have the word level, but not ones that would sort of meet criteria for, you know, being on like autism spectrum. But there have been people who've studied those kids, not very many, but there has been some studies of those children, and they do show that there's their socio-emotional networks, like first of all, their narrative text processing is impaired and related to their social skills. And then I believe there's also been some imaging studies that have shown that the networks associated with theory of mind have to do with the intervention response. Then your second question about pharmaceuticals. Well, I guess if I want to be cynical like you, well, you were just saying cynical in terms of money and business. So I'm going to guess that the pharmaceutical companies would definitely be interested if it was something that would bring a lot more revenue into their world. But I will say that, my mentor, Martha Denkla, made the exact same observations that you did, and I remember sitting and listening to her talk about cases where she would recommend putting individuals on stimulant medication, even if they didn't necessarily meet, pure criteria for ADHD, and seeing the same thing, that the responsiveness was better. But, she would say, we'd all do better on Ritalin, right? Like most of us probably would be able to. I guess I shouldn't say that out loud in a talk. But.
It's an empirical question. We could keep going for a long time, but at this point, we have to stop and move upstairs. So Dr. Cutting will be having lunch with the residents and fellows. A few extras can certainly be accommodated to ask further questions. But as indication of our interest, we could go on longer. We won't, but we will thank you. This is great.
Thank you.